I think the key lesson learned is that Dr. Fauci misled the country, and he did so right from the get-go. By February 1st, 2020, Dr. Fauci knew 7 fundamental facts, represented by the first 7 posters behind me, 7 fundamental facts that he did not share with the American people. First, he understood that American tax dollars went to EcoHealth, and that money was then funneled to a lab in Wuhan, China. Second, he knew EcoHealth was given an exemption from the pause on gain-of-function research. Third, the security standards at this lab in China were deficient. Fourth, Dr. Fauci knew that EcoHealth was not in compliance with their grant reporting requirements. They weren't adhering to the contract. Fifth, gain-of-function research was, in fact, being conducted in the lab in Wuhan, China. Sixth, the P3CO interagency review process wasn't followed in approving the grant to EcoHealth. And finally, 7, Dr. Fauci likely knew, let me say it the other way, Dr. Fauci knew that the virus likely came from the lab that our money was sent to. So think about it. American tax dollars went to a company that wasn't properly vetted, that didn't comply with its contract, who sent that money to a lab in China that wasn't up to code and was doing gain-of-function research. And what happens? The very city where that lab is at, a deadly virus breaks out, a deadly virus that would ultimately kill 6 million people around the world. And what did Dr. Fauci do when he had this information, again, February 1st, 2020? What did he do with this information? Did he tell the President of the United States? Did he go to the Commander-in-Chief and said, hey, we got a deadly virus that's broken out in China, in Wuhan, where we've been sending American tax dollars to a lab that's not up to code, that's doing gain-of-function? Did he tell the President of the United States? Didn't tell the President. Did he tell the Chief of Staff? You know, maybe he thought, you know what, I don't want to take this bad news to the Commander-in-Chief. Maybe I'll give it to the Chief of Staff. I know he'll tell him. He talks to him every day. Did he tell the Chief of Staff? Didn't tell him either. How about the experts in our government? Did he tell his boss? Did he tell Secretary Azar? Did he tell Dr. Redfield, Dr. Birx? Did he tell Dr. Giroir, one of our witnesses today? Didn't tell any of them either. No, what he did instead was organize a conference call February 1st, 2020, 2 p.m. with him, Mr. Collins, and 11 virologists from around the world who he had been handing out American tax dollars to for years and years and years. And on that call, it's interesting. On that call are a couple virologists, Dr. Gary, Christian Anderson, who had said things like this. Here's what Christian Anderson said: virus looks engineered, virus not consistent with evolutionary theory. He said that on January 31st, the day before. Dr. Gary said on February 1st, that very day they had the conference call, I don't know how this gets done in nature, but it would be easy to do in a lab. They all get on this conference call, they get their story straight, and 3 days later, the very people who said this thing came from a lab change their tune and say that anyone who thinks that's crazy. Wow, that's a dramatic change in a matter of days, and the only real intervening event was this conference call that Dr. Fauci organizes. You know, it's bad enough when you have the truth and you don't share it, but what's worse is when you have the truth and you say things that directly contradict it. Dr. Fauci told us over the last several years it wasn't our tax dollars. Yes, it was. Right there's the grant to EcoHealth. He told us it wasn't gain of function. How about this email from NIAID, from Mr. Dazik, the head of EcoHealth, to NIAID, where he says, Dear Jenny, this is terrific. We are happy to hear that our gain of function research funding pause has been lifted. Dr. Fauci told us it wasn't a lab leak. Sure looks like it was. Sure looks like it was, and the people he's been handing out the money to, Mr. Anderson, Mr. Gary, said it was. And that's not to mention all the other crazy things he's told us. The vaccinated can't get it. The vaccinated can't transmit it. Boy, he was wrong about those. He told us that masks work. He told us that there was no such thing as natural immunity when it came to this virus. All kinds of things he told us wrong. So the lessons we learned is you can't trust some of the folks who were supposed to be giving us accurate information, because they sure didn't. And they knew from the get-go They knew from the start. So I look forward to hearing from our witnesses. Look forward to seeing exactly what's in this report. That we didn't get into any of this. We didn't get into any of this. The chairman mentioned we can't look backwards. What we sure should look backwards, because if you got a government not giving it to you straight, that's something that you have to make sure we understand so it doesn't happen again. Not only we don't want a terrible virus happening again, we don't want the government misleading us about a virus that could happen. So we're going to look at this issue starting next month. We'll look into it. We'll make sure the country gets the facts like they should have had on February 1st, 3 years ago. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I now recognize Mr. Jordan from Ohio for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ratcliffe, I think Dr. McCormick was on to the right question. It seems to me the fundamental question is why? Why did they lie to us? And why is it taking so long? You point this out in your testimony. Why is it taking so long for every government agency to admit what we all know? Because belief in a lab leak as the origin of, as the start of this, is not a conspiracy theory, is it, Mr. Ratcliffe?
No.
Why is it taking so long then? I mean, you knew that early on, right? If I look at you, you knew that you were confirmed, I think, in May of 2020, and you knew that within weeks that this thing came from a lab. In fact, you say that, I think, in your testimony. You say a lab leak is the only explanation, only credible explanation. If this were a trial, the preponderance of the evidence is all on the side of the lab leak. You knew that within weeks. So why did the government not tell us the truth?
Well, I think, you know, when you look at the intelligence community report that the Biden administration put out in October of 21, they acknowledge that China's refusal to cooperate, but the report in any way ignores what I think is the inescapable fact and reality that if the CCP had anything exculpatory, anything at all, anything that would be helpful to showing that no one was to blame for this, right, that this occurred naturally, that they would share that. And, you know, why not share data, samples, research, everything that tends to show that they had access to, that would tend to show that this was naturally occurring and tend to show that lab leak theory really was a conspiracy theory. But they didn't do that because they couldn't do that. And to me, that's why making an assessment with some level of confidence is something that should have been done a long time ago by the intelligence community. Yeah, we need to protect sources and methods. It's why Mike Pompeo and I labored over how much of this can we put out, hoping that it would drive the next administration coming in to declassify more information, which they haven't, and would drive congressional hearings into the origins of this, which it didn't.
Here's what gets me. So the Director of National Intelligence knew this thing came from a lab. The Secretary of State knew this thing came from a lab. Common sense tells you this thing came from a lab. And frankly, even the guys who called us names knew it came from a lab because we have their emails. We have their emails from the start. Mr. Gary says, I don't know how this happens in nature. It'd be easy to do in a lab. Mr. Anderson says, this is not consistent with evolutionary. Everyone knew at the get-go. You knew at the get-go. And yet, they tell us just the opposite. Why?
Well, you left out the top public health official, a virologist, Dr. Redfield.
Dr. Redfield knew. He's testified, yes.
Also testified. So you did. You had the top diplomat, the top of the intelligence community, the top public health official, all telling you with some confidence level that the most likely origin of this was a lab leak. And I think that, you know, unfortunately for political reasons and political narratives, it was difficult.
So did you talk with Dr. Fauci during this time frame when you get in May and over the next several months? Did you talk to Dr. Fauci anytime?
No.
Never spoke with Dr. Fauci?
No.
Do you find that strange when he's out saying something directly contrary to the Secretary of State, to the Director of National Intelligence, and to the top virologist, Dr. Redfield, that Dr. Fauci wouldn't talk with you?
Yeah, to be clear, there were folks within the coronavirus task force that were communicating, you know, medical and scientific information to the intelligence community, not me directly, but none of that information was frankly consistent with what we've talked about, what the intelligence showed. Again, some of those individuals, to include Dr. Fauci, were promoting the idea that this was natural origins, and notwithstanding the language that was read, they were referring to it publicly as a conspiracy theory in certain conversations.
Dr. Collins called us
and interviews.
conspiracy theorists if you believed in the lab as the origin. Tell me why do you think Fauci and Collins took that? I got my theory, and I think I'm right, but I'd like to hear from the Director of National Intelligence what he thinks Fauci and Collins' motivation for sharing false information with the American people.
Well, I think the best evidence of that is their own conversations, which say that they didn't want unwarranted or unwanted, or I think the term was unwanted attention to the relationships that were taking place between Western virologists and those working within
Maybe
the Wuhan Institute of
maybe-
Virology, and funding sources for some of that research.
Our money to a lab in China that wasn't up to code, that was doing gain-of-function research, and that's where this thing came from. That's what they didn't want us to know. Do you agree with that, Mr. Ratcliffe?
I do agree with that.
That's important. Thank you. I yield back.